If you were a kid in the early 2000s, then you remember a time when the Tony Hawk series was as synonymous with gaming as Mario or Madden. I mean, these games were absolutely huge, capitalizing on the success of the X Games. Neversoft's take on skateboarding quickly eclipsed the popularity of the sport it was emulating, turned the Birdman into a household name, and shaped the musical taste of a generation. The first 4 games released under the Tony Hawk's Pro Skater banner are typically viewed as the series' golden age, and it's not hard to see why. Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 2 is literally the second highest rated game of all time on Metacritic, and Pro Skater 3 isn't that far behind it, occupying the 15th spot, while Pro Skater 4's 94 rating ties it with such classics as Devil May Cry and 2018's God of War. And it was during this time that Neversoft would refine their combo-driven gameplay to a razor's edge. I mean, it's absolutely ridiculous how easy it still is to pop in one of those games and find yourself falling into that zen-like state and addicted to chasing high scores over 20 years later. These games are just masterfully crafted, and they're the definition of old school arcadey goodness. Naturally, this leads to people thinking of the games that followed as the series being in decline, and I think that's really unfair. Up through Project 8, the quality of these games remained remarkably high, which is pretty amazing when you remember that Activision was forcing Neversoft to pump these titles out yearly. The series would eventually become a victim of its own success, as each new entry would be held up against the franchise's peak and inevitably fall short, and there's no game that suffers from this comparison more than Tony Hawk's Underground. Man, if you were the right age, then when Underground came out, this was like an event. This was like a Grand Theft Auto release. Like, this was absolutely huge. I mean, Neversoft was promising to completely reinvent the formula, and to their credit, they didn't really need to yet. I mean, Tony Hawk's 4 was one of the best-selling games of 2002, and they could have easily just copy and pasted the same old, until critics and gamers called them out. Now, to be fair, they had started this process with 4, moving away from the old school 2-minute runtimes, but 4 always felt like a weird half step to me. Underground, on the other hand, felt like a true evolution of the franchise for me. Its name change alone signified that this wasn't your older brother's same old pro skater. Of course, simply changing the name has also affected how we view it retroactively. If it'd just been called Pro Skater 5, then we'd all mentally slot it in next to the first 4 games and probably consider it to be part of the series' golden age. Instead, it stands as the defining line that marks the start of the post-Pro Skater era. Then again, with its big selling points being a true story mode, being able to get off your board, and the inclusion of gimmicky vehicle segments, Underground would have always put off some purists no matter its title. Over the course of the first 4 Pro Skaters, Neversoft essentially perfected their brand of virtual skating, and they had no more game-changing tricks like the manual or the revert to pull out. So instead, they took their finely tuned gameplay and put it into a greater context than simply chasing high scores. Unlike Pro Skater 4's career mode, which sends you off to strut up various spots without any rhyme or reason, the story mode in Underground features just that, an actual story. Your creative skater starts off as a nameless nobody kicking in the slums of Jersey, and their goal is to prove that they have the skittles that it takes to be a pro. Along the way, though, they're constantly getting dicked over by their childhood pal, Eric Sparrow. As anybody who played Underground can attest to, Eric Sparrow is probably the greatest villain in sports game history, and while it's not exactly a long list, he more than earns its place at the top. He starts off by dragging you into trouble with the local dealers, forgets to sign you up for a skate competition, steals the footy of you nailing a McTwist over a helicopter in Hawaii, then is responsible for you getting arrested and detained in Russia, which is somehow more relevant than ever. And was there ever a more punchable face to grace the PS2? Seriously, after you call him out for failing to sign you up in Tampa, he reacts like he just got caught trying to swipe a pie off a windowsill in a silent movie. God, I hate this guy. And it's a very minor detail, but I love the way that you're able to choose which team your skater signs up with when they turn pro. It doesn't amount to anything more than whose logos are up around certain levels, and unlocking that brand's gear for use with custom skaters, but it made it feel much more personal than if it had simply been assigned to you. And I just find it hilarious how the Element video is just Bam rambling about how skating in Philly is the greatest thing ever when it's not even one of the locations in the game. The story mode also allowed some of the pros like Bam and Chad Muska to showcase their personality like never before. When Muska rolls up in his Escalade and gives you a free skateboard, I remember thinking as an 8-year-old that he was the coolest dude ever. However, despite being the star of the series, Tony Hawk's presence is surprisingly minimal. I don't know if 2003 was just a busy year for the guy and he couldn't fit a lot of voice work into his schedule, but he's only in a handful of scenes and he has very little impact on the actual story. It's not a bad thing exactly, it's just a little weird. But despite now featuring a true story, the actual format of how you progress through the levels hadn't really changed all that much from Pro Skater 4, for better and worse. Each level has some NPCs waiting around to give you a mission, and these can be tackled in any order. Underground does break each level up into acts, but all this really means is that once you complete enough goals, a story sequence occurs, and then the next set of missions becomes unlocked. The game is at its best when it's emulating the classic Tony Hawk experience by having you complete high scores, collect skater combo letters, and enter competitions. But it's also mixed in with weaker goals pulled from Tony Hawk 4, like do a lip trick on this object 3 times, or do a 360 spine transfer over this 5 times. Stuff like that would be fine if they were just limited to the tutorial, but you're still getting these basic ass goals near the end of the game. And on the standard difficulty at least, the game didn't really provide too much of a challenge, aside from the part where you build your own team and have to do more unique goals like spine transfer onto a hotel, or have your combos limited by the moveset of each Tony Hawk game. I would have loved to have seen more stuff like this, but for the most part, Neversoft played it pretty safe. Well, when they weren't allowing you to burn rubber through the streets as Underground introduced proper motorized vehicles to the series for the first time, and yeah, it's not tough to see why they didn't stick around for the long run. Every time I had to get behind the wheel, I let out a pain groan and prayed to be over as soon as possible. I get wanting to introduce something to change up the pace, but the various mini-games like Tennis and Shopping Cart Bam from Pro Skater 4 just worked a lot better and provided more variety, whereas every single vehicle section is either a race or a budget version of Crazy Taxi. Getting off your board, on the other hand, was one of those additions like the Revert, where you don't know how you ever got along without it. Simply being able to walk upstairs instead of have to go around the long way would have been worth it alone, but Neversoft also used it to play with verticality in a lot of interesting ways. Suddenly, even rooftops were potential skate spots. And I've got to make sure to give Underground a ton of credit for allowing players to make and play through the story as a fully voiced female skater. Back in 2003, it definitely wasn't the standard, and just from personal experience, I can say its inclusion is what got my sister into it back in the day. And really, that speaks to what made Underground so special, is how it embraced custom content. Yeah, the character creation options seem limited now, but back in 2003, this was pretty much unmatched on consoles. In addition to making your own custom skater, you could also make your own special moves and even your own deck design. You know, skateboarding is all about expressing yourself, and I don't know if there's a game that understood and embraced that more in the series than Underground. And if you were playing on the PS2 or PC, you could take all that stuff in addition to any parts that you created, and then put them online for other players to download, and you could download anything that they'd made. I mean, it was absolutely insane back in 2003 to have that kind of custom content available at your fingertips. Underground fostered a true community back in the day, and it's a shame that all that stuff's been lost to history. Soundtrack slaps just like you'd expect, featuring a diverse range of artists such as Sublime, Jane's Addiction, Transplants, Nas, Murs, Kool Keith, and many others, and the level design here can go toe-to-toe with any entry in the series. Despite opening things up more than ever before, it's still extremely tight, and veteran players could easily combo all around the map and back again, and that trademark sophomore Neversoft humor is in full effect, with hidden gaps such as the wet beaver and on the pipe again. If you just want that old school Tony Hawk Pro Skater experience, then work your way through the story as quickly as possible so you can unlock all these maps for use in free mode, which lets you kick off a 2-minute run at any time. It might not have revolutionized the extreme sports subgenre as much as its predecessors, but when people talk about the golden age of the Tony Hawk series, Underground needs to be included in the conversation. Whether 2020's remake of the first 2 games reignited your love of the franchise or introduced you to it for the first time, Tony Hawk's Underground is still worth a second look.